Oh, hello. As you can tell, I am not starving. Unfortunately, there's over 800 million starving people in the world right now. Studies show that people do not like starving to death. There's a common misconception that there's not enough food to go around to everyone. Wrong. There's plenty of food to go around, so let's investigate some strategies to solve that problem. Okay, so in Brazil, the problem is that out of the 200 million population, 1/5 or 40 million is starving. So the problem in Brazil can be summed up by a mathematical equation. Starvation of the people plus exportation of all the food there leads to more starving Brazilians. So for my paper, I focused on the northeast section of Brazil, which can be found here in the shaded in green area. And this is where a lot of the major food exporters are located, and it also happens to be the most poverty-stricken area in Brazil. The ideal scenario would be to stop exporting food, because there's no reason that starving people should have to watch food be exported out of their neighborhood rather than eating it to not starve. So, let's investigate whether it's actually feasible. Socially, very feasible, because people like to not starve, and people also like to help out their community, typically. Politically, very possible, because of people supporting the idea of it. Scientifically, really easy. You just have to not mail food away. But economically, Brazil has an awesome economy right now, but food exportation is the major reason for that, and it's not economically feasible to expect them to cut that out or minimize that. So, now that stopping exportation is not an option, the next best option is education. Since we're not able to stop exportation, education is the next best option. There's an inverse correlation between education and poverty, which leads to hunger. Economically, education is very possible because we're going to still have all that money coming in through exportation, and then politically, they can make policies to move that money around and pump it into the education system. Socially, very possible because education and learning is pretty socially acceptable anywhere in the world. And there's absolutely no scientific reason why education cannot work. There are many stakeholders in the issue. The three that I'm going to focus on are the government, food companies, and consumers. The government, they care about the issue because their platforms on the issue will either win or lose them votes. Food companies have a lot to gain or lose because they're the ones that are making or losing money on the policies with this issue. And the consumers, they have the most to gain or lose because if they don't eat, they could die.
After a U.S. challenge at the World Trade Organization in 2004, biodiversity was replaced by monocultures and industrialized seed, displacing many Indian farmers. Created was a cycle of death, despair, and suicide amongst the Indian farmer. In the last decade alone, 250,000 farmers have committed suicide, and by the end of today, 46 more Indian farmers will commit suicide as well. So far in my research, I've focused on 4 stakeholders, the Indian government being the first. So far as I know, the Indian government is deeply ambivalent about its obligations even to its poorest citizens. In turn, these Indian farmers are displaced by this, the lack of the Indian government to do anything. And they can reinvent their sovereignty, or they can establish their sovereignty by reinventing the government. But also another displacement factor is Monsanto, which controls 90% of GM crop. Navdanya comes into play when it's an NGO, Indian-based NGO, that tries to fight corporate giants like Monsanto in establishing the seed sovereignty and sovereignty of farmers in India. So far, I believe the most feasible solution to the biopiracy scandal in India right now is Navdanya, which is an Indian-based NGO. So far, it has established about 115 seed banks throughout India, and it was founded by Vandana Shiva, a world-renowned physicist and advocate of the biopiracy problem. She strives to establish the seed democracy back into the farmers' lives, as well as all the biodiversity that was lost when farmers like Monsanto came into town. Navdanya is socially plausible because it helps establish seed sovereignty in farmers, thus empowering them. Scientifically plausible because the farmers already know how to farm. They are just bringing back in the seed quality that restores the soil quality. They're bringing back that biodiversity. Politically, it is kind of an issue with most of the government. That's why Navdanya comes into the picture, because they work with grassroots organizations and regional governments to implement their plans and their policies. Economically, it works because funds like grants given out by Small Planet Fund help Navdanya continue to grow and expand in its processes.
Despite this agricultural success, India's food production still has a lot of room to grow. The problem is that many farmers in rural communities are uneducated about sustainable practices for irrigation and water and soil conservation. These issues can lead to larger issues such as erosion, poor soil quality, and droughts and flooding. 64% of India's cultivated land is rain-fed, mostly from monsoons, so droughts and flooding are a huge problem. Better irrigation systems can have more consistency with their water, which will lead to more crops being grown. Poor soil quality is an issue because if the soil is lacking in nutrients, farmers are going to have to make up for that with chemicals and pesticides. And many of those chemicals are going to end up in the food that you and I eat. Now, erosion, if left unchecked, will cause land to over time degrade and eventually become unusable. Whatever the solution to these problems is, it's going to have to start from India's farmers. That solution involves NGOs running farmer field schools where they would go to Indian communities and teach farmers better practices. But first, let's talk about the stakeholders. The Indian people. Over 3/4 of Indian families depend on agriculture as their main source of income. This includes 770 million rural Indians who are still living in poverty. It would be the farmers' responsibility to show up to these school classes and participate in experiments so that they can learn the new techniques and improve their farms. Participation is not mandatory, and a similar program like this worked in 2007, so it is expected to be well received. Likewise, the Indian government is not expected to be a problem because, as said, the similar program happened in 2007 and participation is not mandatory. The government's role would be more advisory. The NGOs have the experts. They know where and when they're needed, but the government can request or suggest certain places. And as long as the NGOs are operating within the limits of the law, the government should not be a factor. NGOs like the International Rice Research Institute are going to be the ones taking the lead. The International Rice and Research Institute is a worldwide NGO that ran the aforementioned 2007 program. They would partner with local Indian NGOs such as the Morarka Foundation and their experts would have to participate in season-long residential comprehensive training before they were able to run the programs. The UN is also going to play a large role in this because that's where the funding comes from, the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization. Specific donor countries in the past have been countries like Switzerland, the Netherlands, Australia, and Finland, and its funding has come in the form of humanitarian aid. This aid is expected to continue coming, however, because it's going towards a good cause, teaching sustainable agricultural practices and alleviating India's hunger problem. The purpose of farmer field schools is to educate farmers on concepts of irrigation, soil and water conservation, and sustainable agriculture. Specific techniques they'll learn include things like crop rotation and use of organic fertilizers, which put more nutrients into the soil. They'll learn things like proper irrigation, which keeps soil salinity at an acceptable level. Or they'll learn things like planting trees to have stronger root structures and have more windbreaks, which is going to reduce erosion. These farmer field schools are where communities of farmers meet once a week during the entire cropping season. They meet with NGO experts who are helping them conduct experiments. The NGO experts are going to teach in local languages. They've already been there for an entire season, so they're used to the region. So they'll be teaching in local languages or English where necessary. And through the experiments, observations, and group discussions, the farmers are going to learn what specific techniques work for their farms. Not just all farms, but their farms. So this gives the program a level of individuation that other programs do not achieve.
Brazil would be very open to the idea of community seed banks, but they would have to compete with genetically modified foods, which is a very big exportation from Brazil. They would also be very open to farmer field schools, which would help the farmers develop subsistence agriculture so they can grow foods for themselves and their communities.
Bridget's idea for community seed banks is an excellent idea for India because it helps Indian farmers gain independence from big corporations like Monsanto.
And Patrick's Farmer Field Schools helps implement those sustainable agricultures in India's society, as well as the teaching and education practices of Kelly's Brazil would improve the education and have the same effect on India.
Kelly's idea to reduce exports from India likewise would not work in India for the same reasons. India has a growing population that needs food.
Amen.